This is Lendl Foot in Ayrshire. It's home to this road, this random memorial to a Russian battlecruiser, this restless native,
oh, and a family of cannibals who managed to crunch their way through roughly 1,000 people. Welcome to Scotland Unplugged and the Legend of Sawney Bean, Scotland's most notorious cannibal.
Lendl Foot's a funny wee place. It sits on the southwest coast in Ayrshire, and it's pretty much made up of ramshackle huts built by holidaymakers in the middle of the last century. There's a bit of history there though. Some of it real, like the memorial to the Russian cruiser, the Varyag, that ran aground there in 1917. Some of it more distinctly in the realm of myth, like Ailsa Craig, the giant stepping stone, said to have been thrown into the Irish Sea by the giant Finn McCool on his way across to do battle with a Scottish giant. And some of it may be harder to distinguish. It's a bit tricky, but if you cross the road and shin down some cliffs carefully, you'll come to the Binnon Cave.
Sawney Bean's cave.
Unfortunately, as is sometimes the case, I had no clue. So I arrived at a sort of lookout point. There's a viewpoint with a car park, and I arrived there and had been following directions from somebody who'd put an article up online. Thought I could kind of find it with these kind of blog instructions, and it didn't quite go according to plan. I basically wandered about a half a mile in the wrong direction. Fortunately, my brother-in-law and fellow YouTuber, Craigie Boy, was around to help me out.
Hashtag Craigie Boy YouTube channel.
Craig actually grew up in Girvan, which is just along the road from Lendl Foot. So he kind of arrived along with my sister and my niece, and they kind of helped me find the cave, rescued this video, and also probably stopped me falling off a cliff.
Alexander, or Sawney Bean, is said to have been brought into the world sometime in the 15th or 16th century in East Lothian, the son of a ditch digger. Alexander tried to take up the family shovel, but realised that just wasn't the game for him. Sometimes you've just got to go your own way in life. So Sawney ran away with a woman known locally as Black Agnes Douglas. Agnes was a bit vicious and had been accused of the odd bit of witchcraft. I mean, to be fair, that does seem to have been a common side hustle back in the day. Like a lot of young couples starting out, the pair had some cash flow issues, so they subsidised their income with some light robbery. As you do, one of the robberies kind of escalated and ended in Sawney and Agnes eating the victim. But how do you even get into that? How do you start the conversation? Tonight, darling, I'd like to try something a bit different. Supposedly they then set up home here in this picturesque grotto. They weren't the most driven pair, and slowly drifted into robbing and eating people as a sort of cottage industry, without the cottage or the industry. One thing they were very good at was producing offspring. 6 daughters and 8 sons, who were also very good at producing offspring. Sawney and Agnes had 14 granddaughters and 18 grandsons, who were obviously very closely related. The Beans were ruthlessly efficient, working together to ambush victims, sometimes groups of victims. They bring the bodies back to the cave before dismembering, salting, and pickling them. They weren't daft either. They'd throw the odd body part aside. An arm or a leg would wash up on a nearby beach and make it look like the victims had been attacked by animals. Over the course of their life together, the Beans supposedly managed to chomp their way through 1,000 people. That's a big number, not easily concealed. And there were suspicions. But every time people went looking, this place seemed pretty uninhabitable. You can kind of see their point. And the Beans only came out at night. Of course they did. With all the suspicion around, the locals did what locals did back then and started hanging people. They were mostly innkeepers who fell under suspicion, with people just turning up at their establishments and disappearing. But eventually, those Beans got sloppy when they attacked a couple who were riding back from a fair. The pair were on the same horse. The Bean family attacked in a group, and the man rode through them, but the Beans unhorsed his wife, pulling her to the ground. The man fought back with a sword and a pistol. He was outnumbered, but he had some combat experience, and eventually more fairgoers turned up, outnumbering the Beans. They ran. They left behind a partially eaten, disemboweled body, and an explanation for all the disappearances. In the time the man had been fighting, they'd managed to remove his wife's entrails, cut her throat, and drink her blood. The gig was well and truly up. The surviving man was taken to the local magistrate. The word got back to the king, who quickly took charge of the manhunt. He assembled 400 men and sent in the bloodhounds.
All 45 of the Beans were rounded up and brought here to the site of the old Tolbooth prison in Edinburgh. Then they were transported to Leith and executed without trial. The men had their gentleman parts removed, and then their hands and feet. Then they were allowed to bleed to death, while the women in the family watched. When that show was over, the women were burned at the stake.
It's a gruesome story from Scotland's past. It actually inspired Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes. There is also a rumour that the reference to the fava beans in Silence of the Lambs is sort of an Easter egg for cannibal fans the world over. I mean, it might be a rumour I just started, but is the legend real? Well, there's no documented evidence before the 18th century. The first account appeared in 1734 in an English publication. Sawney Bean was first mentioned in the fabulously titled Lives and Actions of the Most Famous Highwaymen, Murderers, Street Robbers, etc. I just love the fact they've got etc. in the title. It's thought to have been written by Daniel Defoe, who also wrote Robinson Crusoe. The name Sawney was actually a derogatory reference to Scotsmen at the time, a bit like Jock is now. So this tale of a Scottish cannibal may actually have been a bit of propaganda. Following on from the Act of Union at the beginning of the century, tensions between the two countries were kind of high. There's no mention of the story in Scotland until 1843, by which time the legend had already passed into folklore. You'd think if the king was involved, not to mention a magistrate, 400 men, 45 executions and all the paperwork involved in that, something would still be written down somewhere.
Who can say? One thing I can say is that standing here, it feels entirely plausible. So I'll let you decide. Sweet dreams.